What we're going to be discussing is the convergence of IT, security, and cyber. Co-moderating with me today, Executive Director of the Cybersecurity Association of Maryland, Tasha Cornish, to my left. Our panelists today have over 45 years of combined experience, subject matter expertise, and leadership in cybersecurity. Founder and CEO of Avent, Marcy Nagel, and to the left of her, Vice President of Information Technology and Chief Information Officer at COP Defense Properties, Ken Kurz. Thank you guys for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, jumping right in. Protecting against digital threats is an investment. What factors go into determining what your security posture needs to be? Either one of you can jump in.
I mean, we can talk about this one alone for the bulk of the day. There's so many things that go into building and establishing a cybersecurity program. First, starting at the foundation is what regulations are you either required to adhere to, or have you opted to implement based on where you want your cybersecurity program to go? And that's largely based on what you're protecting. What are your assets, your high value assets? And what we found is many organizations have the right bricks, if you will, for establishing that cybersecurity program and making those investments, but it's tying it all together is where the trickiness comes into play. And whether you're making investments in technology or cybersecurity tools, I've seen so many times where these tools are less than optimal or not fully configured or optimized to truly get the full benefit of the protections that you've made those investments in. So it's one thing to make the investment, it's the next thing to have the strategy that integrates all of those pieces together in order to bring it to fruition and to protect those high value assets. And then back at the foundations, whether it's 853 or 800-171, or in the IC community, the ICDs, you first got to understand what those building blocks are for the requirements of your organization that best meets your assets protection requirements.
Yeah, I think agree with all that, right? I think the one thing that I would add to that's probably going to be my biggest foot stomp for the day is no matter what environment you're going into, as most of us, a greenfield is probably a rare opportunity in many cases, and many times we're walking into something that somebody else built, and it's understanding what you have in order to know what to protect, that you can therein apply your requirements to. Asset management from the standpoint of any network, whether it's an IT network, an OT network, whatever, knowing what's connected to how it's communicating, sort of lays that foundation for knowing what steps you can take to best protect it, and then again overlay those requirements on top.
I want to pull on that thread of asset management because you would believe that in zero trust, I know we're going to talk about that in a little bit, that device pillar that says you have to know what your entire asset inventory is, every single device that connects to your network. You just need an inventory. So that sounds easy enough. I've supported probably 80% of the .gov through the DHS's Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation Program. And step one of that was just going in and identifying assets. Deploy Forescout, deploy whatever it may be, and detect what you have on there. Well, I'll tell you that was incredibly difficult. And that doesn't even take it to step two, which is authorize those assets. And so it does take a lot of, again, strategy and understanding. You can go to your IT operations team and ask them, how many assets are on your network. And then you go to your compliance team and you ask them how many assets on your network. And I promise you it's going to be two different numbers. And even after deploying visibility tools, deduplicating assets based on unique IDs, that's tricky. And so it's a very difficult thing to do. We, when I was still supporting the CDM program, but at the beginning of that program, DHS gave the SIs about 1 year to deploy asset management capabilities. The contracts were 3 years, and at the end of 3 years, they still did not have an accurate asset count. So again, you're looking at zero trust and thinking about applying that, but just getting over the hurdle of asset management, I'm glad you brought that up, it's a big hill, and it's not a once and done thing. It's something that you got to commit to.
Yeah, and just we can kind of riff on this.
Yeah,
right?
please.
Like, again, my background experience, right, is been in cybersecurity for 20 plus years. This IT OT discussion is relatively new to me in the last 7 or 8. And from an asset management standpoint, I think one of the things we struggle with the most that may resonate with this community here has been the traditional way from an IT standpoint. We're going to plug a device in, we're going to use a tool, it's going to passively listen and sort of discover what's on the network. But the way we see in a lot of cases from an HVAC perspective and other sort of OT systems is daisy chaining devices behind each other, using 2-wire to connect one device to the next. And right, so from an IT perspective, you lose visibility downstream. And therefore, you may see one device and there may be 10 behind it, right? Which is why it's perfectly believable that over in 3 years, they would never have a good asset inventory for what is actually out there. And that's a huge challenge for this community.
I'll give one more use case and trying to solve that one problem. We were deploying asset management capabilities across CBP. And of course, you need unique identifiers to uniquely identify each of the assets and then authenticate them. They had 700 devices with the exact same serial number on them, and you're using the serial number, you're pulling that off of when you're doing your scanning tools. And we're like, well, how can they have 700 assets all across the United States with the exact same serial number? And I was like, well, let's see, CBP's mission. I bet those are license plate readers. And it turns out that the vendor of the license plate reader company, I don't know who it was actually, they didn't think it was necessary to uniquely identify those endpoints. And so as we're pulling all of this in and we're trying to deduplicate and figure out asset counts and apply protections, we thought something rogue was on there, but no, actually it was a license plate reader, which is an access point into your environment that also needs to be authenticated and authorized. And so that's why. And I know we'll probably talk about, what can industry do to help in cybersecurity, but it's understanding the needs of uniquely being able to identify what's on your network so that you can deploy the right protections.
So we've heard a little bit about the resources and investment needed and the strategy needed to implement a cybersecurity plan. How would you evaluate the risk of not implementing a cybersecurity plan for our physical security systems?
So I'd like to get to a point where that we understand that every device, whether the mission is a license plate reader, a barrier, or it's a database, they all pose a risk to an organization's assets. And the mission resilience of an organization. So we have to understand what each of those things do uniquely, but they still have a requirement to not disrupt a mission. And so you've got to look at how the security needs to be implemented. It's going to be different. There is no cookie cutter way to apply 853, 171, you name it. And unfortunately, I will say some cybersecurity practitioners, because there's so much to do, will approach a physical security system with their cookie cutter approach that they did the IT system or the database or the whatever it may be, and it doesn't fit. And so what really needs to happen is just starting with understanding the nuances of applying controls and tailoring controls and understanding when they're just not applicable because it doesn't connect or it's behind whatever it may be, but just cybersecurity practitioners need to start with a level of understanding that every system is unique, particularly your OT systems, your physical security systems. But they pose just a bigger risk. They are an access point that a nefarious actor can use to move laterally across your environment. And whether it's an HVAC system, it's just you have to look at cybersecurity uniquely based on the technology, but you got to first understand the nuances of the technology. And a lot of cyber practitioners, they have an IT degree, maybe a computer science degree, and they don't understand the nuances, nor do they take the time. And I'll just end by saying this, that we sat down with one of our security control assessment counterparts. So we represent the system owners, we have physical security systems, and we're sitting across from a security control assessor who has their checklist, and they're applying, whether it's 853 or whatever it may be, against, this is what you need to do without first understanding. And so I asked their leadership, we had a time to go to happy hour, and I said, do you guys stop for a moment and first do some sort of discovery on what the technology is, what the mission is, what are the capabilities of this thing before you go in with your checklist? And they're like, yeah, we just don't have time. And I say you don't have time not to, because you're not doing anybody any justice or service if you don't. So if you are a system owner or representing a capability, a physical security capability, and you're on the other side of the auditor, first have a conversation about what your technology is, what it does, what are compensating controls, what it doesn't do, so that you can have a real conversation about what security should and should not be applied, instead of sort of keeping the chasm between the two of you, and they don't understand me, so I'll never understand them. And it's just like in life. Just start with a basic understanding of where each other sits, and then you can actually get to real security that is meaningful in protecting the resilience of whatever the function is of that physical electronic security system. Soapbox.
So I'll give a recent sort of war story with respect to the risk of cybersecurity in a physical security system. So in many of our properties, we outsource access control to a third party that we've been working with for a number of years. And on a weekday afternoon, we have a facility manager gets a random email from somebody at that company that says you need to implement fire watches in all of your properties immediately. Right? Well, we don't have enough people to stand fire watch in every building, and there were really no details going along with that. But what we came to find out was they had a cybersecurity incident that affected their ability to collect alarms, right, for fire, for access control, and everything else coming off of our facilities, along with other customers. And they really didn't have a good plan for how to communicate and deal with that with us as customers of theirs. And so, what it turned out being, or at least what we've found out to date, it was a ransomware attack against what looks like some database server that they had sort of forgotten about, that was under a desk somewhere, that what I believe had the database that matched up alarms coming in to what actually was alarming. Right, and so it took them a number of days to figure that out. We had to go across to all of our facilities and go reset panels and do a whole host of things. And so, the lesson learned for us, right, is we're sort of outsourcing that risk to a third party that obviously did not have all the cybersecurity controls in place that needed to be there. Now, the other side of that is that the sort of mindset with respect to ransomware and other things is not if that it'll never happen. It's just sort of when will it happen. But it did affect us in an adverse way. It affected our tenants in an adverse way, as far as we were sort of lucky. We were up against a weekend, but we couldn't put people in those buildings. We didn't know if the access control system was compromised as part of that, whether or not new users were introduced or golden masters were created or that sort of thing. We had to go through that exercise. So there's a lot of work that was created, not only for them but for us, as the customer, because there was a breakdown in the cybersecurity infrastructure or architecture for that access control system.
Kind of talking to the implementation of cybersecurity measures, who needs to be involved from that aspect of that conversation up front, maybe before, during, after, ongoing? Does it have to be security department, IT, cyber teams, third-party agencies, everyone? Who should be at the table when we're talking about this?
Yeah. So Marcy kind of started that discussion, right? Give another little story, right? So I showed up at COPT about 7-8 years ago, and we happened to be our friends at Fort Meade, this is the largest landlord, right? So we lease them and defense contractors and a whole group of other folks, a bunch of buildings just to the west of the BW Parkway. And we were asking a lot of questions about the facility-related control systems in those buildings, how they were connected, who could connect to them, and so on, because we wanted to do some more remote management in a way that we felt was secure. We had constantly gotten the answer from the government, no, you can't do that. Well, I don't really like taking no as an answer, and so part of that was, well, who's saying no and why? And so what it turned out was that our facility managers, property managers, and so on kept going and asking the physical security folks if we were allowed to remotely connect to a building. And there was a big disconnect in understanding, both operationally and technically, with respect to what it is we were trying to do. And so what ended up happening was it took a meeting of the minds, right? We had to have folks from physical security, from folks that understood cybersecurity, folks that understood control systems, folks that understood every piece and part of what it is that we wanted to do as the asset owner and operator, so that everybody could agree, hey, that really probably isn't a bad idea, but we just kept hearing no because we didn't have the right folks at the table. And so it's been hugely successful for our company because we've been able to ensure that all of our buildings are actually removed from the internet, that they're managed in a way that meets all these requirements. Mm-hmm. We're more efficient. We're able to reduce some costs. Our technicians don't need to drive around with 3 different laptops in the back of their trucks anymore for the specific version of Java that the Jace needs to actually, for them to connect. We've sort of solved a lot of those technical problems that have had operational efficiencies that have gone along with it, just because we finally had that conversation, and everybody's good with it, right? And so it was sort of that gateway of us being able to do other things, ensuring that we had all the right folks there.
That is so critical. If you don't get around the table, either figuratively or literally, you will be talking past each other, and you will have to accept a no when no just didn't even make sense. When it was no because that was maybe the easy answer, or they had the wrong parameters in place. But if you're hearing no, find a way to get to yes. And as a cybersecurity firm, one of our core values is start with yes. Because cybersecurity needs to be a mission enabler. We're not the mission in many cases, unless you're CISA. We are an enablement. And so if you're working with cybersecurity practitioners and their first answer is, no, you can't do this, well, it's like, well, let's figure that out. Who is saying that and why? And let's get a bigger picture here.
So we've heard a little bit about the intersection of convergence of IT and physical security. How is this impacting how we think about cybersecurity measures? And should all endpoint devices fall under the same regulations?
Yes. So I'll take that in a little different direction, in that I think both physical security and cybersecurity is a data issue. I think it's a battle that we should be fighting with data. And so pulling in asset information from your physical security devices, pulling in threat intelligence from your physical security organizations, the same way that cybersecurity pulls in intelligence from Mandiant or Alien Vault, and really gaining the full picture is how you're going to ultimately combat threats, whether that's physical or whether that's cyber. And I liken it to back in, let's see, when was it, 2009, right after the Fort Hood shooting and the Christmas Day shoe bomber on the plane. I worked at the FBI. I was with the FBI for about a decade. And as it turns out, in both of those instances, the FBI had data on those subjects. And unfortunately, it was spread across roughly 100 disparate data sets. And they did not have a Google-like system in order to correlate the data against these threats in order to usurp neither of those instances, unfortunately. And so, fast forward to today in cybersecurity and perhaps in physical security, cyber warriors are logging into, let's say, 24 different data sets and trying to manually correlate what's going on with this asset, whether you're logging into your Forescout, your BigFix, or your McAfee HBSS, and trying to manually figure out what's going on in the world. Well, I would offer that as far as endpoints and data, physical security endpoints, we need all of that information to include sort of user behavior activity in order to gain a real picture and get ahead of the different threat actors and truly achieve strong cybersecurity through deploying protections as well as response when anomalous activities comes up. And so data is the key. But we have to be willing to pull in the data from your physical security, even the event logs from what's happening when people are badging in, what's happening when people are logging in, and correlating that to see, well, this person just badged in, at the Pentagon. However, I'm getting this activity from over in Russia or even Florida. And so trying to understand what's happening in the physical security realm, correlate, and this isn't happening today. I don't know an organization personally that is going so far as to making those connections between what's happening in your physical security, both from the device perspective and what the sensors are grabbing, so that we can gain that big picture and get ahead of what the threat actors are, create those signatures on both sides of the house in order to combat true threats to the organization.
So I think data is going to be a huge part of that, right? And being able to not only aggregate it, but know what to do with it.
Yes.
I think I'll give a slightly different answer, and I'll say it depends, right, from an endpoint standpoint. Because when I look at our portfolio of properties, yes, we do a lot in the defense realm, right? And we have a set of requirements we need to meet. But the threat posture is going to be very different for some of the commercial properties that we have, say, in downtown Baltimore, right, where the threat there is roving gangs of teens, and I need to have eyes on what's happening around the building. But if I'm using a cloud-managed camera system, I'm probably okay, right, from that perspective. If I can put the right controls around it, I don't have DoD requirements or government requirements that I need to meet to do that. Whereas if I have a fully skiffed building, I have a system that can't touch the internet. I have a different set of gear, right? That I'm going to put in there from just using cameras as the example. I have a totally different camera system sitting down in San Antonio at the Texas Cryptologic Center than I do in downtown Baltimore. And so I think there's again, going back to the original question that we opened up with, it's sort of looking at what's the risk posture and the types of vulnerabilities and types of threat actors that are going to be potentially interested in whatever that target is. So yeah, I think we're definitely heading down a path where obviously we've moved more and more away from 2-wire, we've moved more and more away from coax, we've moved everything's got an Ethernet port on the back of it. And this is kind of what I've seen in our space, in this IT/OT world, is that everybody likes to talk about that there's these two communities and they can't communicate and they generally don't like each other and so on. I think we've had a lot of success internally, culturally, where we really focus on what are we good at, right? Like, I'm not good at HVAC or access control, or my team is not, but we're pretty good at like networking and backups and identity and access management and things that are sort of the table stakes from a cybersecurity perspective that we can bring into that OT environment. Because the majority of the time, like the things that are getting breached and attacked are the stuff that runs that environment. It's not the PLC that's sitting down on a plant floor somewhere, right? If we can talk about Stuxnet and things like that. I mean, those are very targeted, very specialized things. Right? Most of this is just targets of opportunity, kind of like the example that I just gave with respect to the company that does a lot of our access control. It was a database server under a desk somewhere. It had nothing to do with the swipes on the wall, right? But it had a significant impact to their operations, to our operations, and how all that works. And so, I did a quick walk through the room next door. I mean, can't tell me all that stuff's hooked to a network switch somewhere, right? And so that's where the technology is going. And we're moving farther and farther, I think, to the right, where you need that expertise on both sides, really, to understand that operational technology and how it works, because it's becoming far more complicated and complex, the same way that the IT folks have something to bring to the table so that, they have decades of experience in doing cybersecurity work. We're seeing this a lot from the standpoint of, use HVAC controllers as the example, where these controllers now, we're talking a lot about BACnet SC, BACnet Secure, and so on, and how we're going to implement that. Whereas our HVAC, integrators don't really want to have the conversation. I know our technicians definitely don't want to have the conversation. But on the IT side, on the cybersecurity side, we've been doing certificate management for decades, right? PKI is not a big deal. And so, but that's really what BACnet SC is. It's certificates for those devices. And we talk about, should all these endpoints have the same standard? Well, yeah, eventually, right? Mm-hmm. The devices, should be able to authenticate themselves to the network in a safe and secure way. And that's where we're going. But I wouldn't tell our OT folks that you need to totally shift their career and go learn cybersecurity now. Like, we can do that as a team. Right, and I think that's the biggest shift in this industry is, the technology is becoming so much more complicated. We're integrating far more capabilities into these devices that it's going to take everybody at the table. No one's going to know every piece and part of it.
Well, let's fast forward a decade, and Zero Trust is sort of gaining some training wheels, and we're getting to really getting to a point where every single device needs to be authenticated. So we're talking about the devices that today may not connect to the internet, but should or will in the future. And so we need to understand how are we going to get there. Zero Trust also, the assumption is in Zero Trust that you have to treat every single device in your environment as if it touches the internet, in a way that you're testing it, in the way that you are securing it. Now, that's not to go lock down everything as it's on the internet, but it is thinking outside of what we have today and where we're going to be in 10 years, because I think it's going to take us 10 years to get to move beyond the defense in depth thought into a true Zero Trust environment where everything has to authenticate and be identified.
Well, and the stuff that, if we're 10 years in the future, right?
Yeah.
The stuff you put in today and the stuff you put in 10 years ago will be there 10 years in the future.
True.
Right? And so it's really from a brownfield, greenfield, but looking from a brownfield perspective, that's the big challenge in our community, right? Is this stuff is not going anywhere. And so, from companies that are developing technology, integrators that are putting it in, how do we work around it to sort of help meet these strategies and meet the intent of what folks are expecting from us, particularly on the government side, right? Because nobody's got the money to go rip it out, much less, why would I take out a crack unit that I just put in 10 years ago, right? And so it's the market is very, very thin for capabilities that help us with that today. But I hope 10 years from now, I'm going to be able to leave those controllers in place. I'm going to be able to leave all this OT stuff and either bolt something on that'll help me meet these strategies, or when it comes time to replace it, it's going to be a plug and play. I'm ready to go. I've got the infrastructure I need in place to accomplish those goals.
I like it.
Okay. Thank you, guys. So we were kind of talking about there needs to be some sort of cybersecurity measures in place for endpoint devices. But like you said, Marcy, you can't be cookie cutter necessarily. Example, if I have like my IT group, I want to have a machine, let's say a Windows machine, I log in incorrectly a certain amount of times, I get locked out. I can't necessarily do that with an endpoint device, because if I lock that device out, I don't have video. So when it comes to that,
Yeah.
where should endpoint devices fall, or where does the organization start in developing a plan for endpoint devices in that case? I mean, I know you said, Ken, that you gotta have everybody at the table so everybody understands the requirements, but how do we approach that if we haven't started?
Yeah, I think that there's been more of a movement over the last 3 to 5 years, I think, to figure that out, right? And especially educating folks on the IT side of the table to certain standards that are out there, like 62443. There's other nonprofit organizations like Building Cybersecurity that have stood up that are looking across 62443. They're looking at 800, the NIST standards. They're looking at the Center for Data Security, and they're working to take the best set of controls that match the mission, right? That really appreciate and understand what we're trying to do from a physical security standpoint, from a facility control systems perspective, because we can't overlay, and I've heard this for years, right? IT wants to come in and patch everything. We can't do that, or put passwords on stuff, right? And it's really sort of an acknowledgement. I think even the newest, the NIST 882 Rev 3 that just got released is really an acknowledgement that we're moving from control systems to Internet of Things, OT systems, things that are that blended technology stack, right? And how do we apply that to how we're using it? From one of the things that I think some of the DoD folks in here may appreciate, right, is when we talk about like CMMC, the Cyber Security Maturity Model certification process. Purposefully, I can't find this out, really a lot of facility-related control systems and anything that's leased, right? So we lease properties to defense contractors. We're not even in that process. Like, it doesn't apply to us. So it's kind of like, what does apply to us, right? I need some standard that I can work towards, meet from a cybersecurity perspective, but also is not going to disrupt, deny, degrade the need for a SOC to operate, right? We have facility control centers in some mission critical facilities. Those we can't lock those screens. But it's understanding the mission, and we need to be able to understand it in order to accept that risk. And again, a lot of it goes back to the conversation, and I think the standards are really starting to evolve to help accommodate that.
No, I love everything you said there, and I just want to touch on understanding the risk and how you mentioned you can't patch those systems. Well, what if in a world we have, let's say all of the vulnerabilities found within an environment identified per device, and then in another world we had all of the threat intelligence out there that's indicated what TTPs threat actors are using in order to exploit that vulnerability. And oh, by the way, that vulnerability doesn't exist on that device. Oh, by the way, no, there's no TTPs that are present on that device, and there's no threats today. But that needs to be assessed in real time because it is also evolving. There's new TTPs identified on a regular basis. There's new threat actors and threat signatures coming out on a daily basis. And so what I'm offering, or what I suggest, is that you maintain that real visibility into what device have which vulnerabilities, or what we call CVEs. What are the TTPs out there that MITRE does a really good job of keeping an eye on, and those are updated regularly, and what threat actors, what is the real threat intelligence, and so that you can make decisions or combat a security professional that says you need to patch that system. It's like, well, actually, if you look at the TTPs that are exploiting the CVE and you look at the threat intelligence, it just doesn't exist. I accept the risk. And without connecting all of those things, you're saying, okay, I have this device. It requires to be patched. I can't patch it because it's going to break it. I have nothing else to give you. It's going to break it. Okay, well, let's take a look. Let's peel back the layer a little bit and look what's in the wild. Let's look at physical security, what's happening in that area, and we have to make decisions in a continuous basis because cybersecurity, just like physical security, is not static. And so we need to get to an understanding of what's really happening in the cyber world or the physical world so that we can make real risk decisions based on all of those factors and no longer make them in just a vacuum based on the traditional likelihood, impact, and vulnerability in a one snapshot in time.
Yeah, I mean, our strategy at 50,000 feet for the control system side of what we do, right, is we're heavily focused on early steps in the attack chain. And the rationale there is, while from an asset management standpoint, we feel like we've got a pretty good handle on the devices that we use as an organization, and we'll keep an eye out for CVEs that are released or something that comes out of CISA or whatever that's related to, the Siemens device here, Distech or whatever, and we'll pass that along to the team, and then we'll have we have bi-weekly recurring meetings where we sit down and we talk through this stuff, and is it something that we care about or not? But the perspective that I've adopted as sort of the organizational leader for cybersecurity risk has really been, if that device at the end state, that camera, that controller or whatever, that VAV has been for whatever reason got compromised, and we have a much bigger problem on our hands, right? Nobody just walked in and found that VAV in the ceiling and plugged into it. There's something that happened, either in the network switching, the servers, somebody got in that system in a more traditional way, then they could do anything they wanted to before they were going to exploit that VAV or that controller at the end at the end of the line, right? And so, that's been my sort of heartache with the community in this. We have, vendors out there that are, you got to patch these PLCs. We got to focus on this. This is what control system cybersecurity is all about. Cool, but if you're running, Server 2008 R2, which is not supported anymore, I think as of today or a couple days ago, and somebody exploited, Eternal Blue or something like that that's been out there. What does it matter? Like, who cares? Who cares if that thing has a vulnerability at the end of it? Because that the goal of these adversaries is not only just to exploit that device, it's to establish persistence in that environment. That's how they're going to do it, right? They're going to exploit something more on the IT side to figure out where they're at, where did they land, what are they going to do, what opportunity do they have. And again, there's some recent things that have come out talk about living off the land. Well, that's exactly it. They want to get in and they don't know where they landed, especially this ransomware attacker that took out our the access control company. They weren't going after them. It was a target of opportunity. So yeah, we're heavily focused on how does an adversary establish access and establish persistence before I'm going to worry about that thing down at the end of the line.
And it's a risk decision. Where are my greatest risks? And you have to have a mechanism to prioritize. One, have visibility, understand them, and then prioritize them based on what's really pressing right now. And so we've worked at our company. We've worked to develop an algorithm that actually combines vulnerability data with your MITRE ATT&CK framework, threats, techniques, and procedures, and real-time threat intelligence so that you can, in an agile way, prioritize which vulnerabilities you need to address first based on real-time data, based on what CVEs are present in your environment, and then make a decision from there because resources are incredibly limited. And so it's just a matter of fixing the worst problem first, the problem that's going to be most likely to be exploited. And it's an ever-evolving game, and it never ends.
So switching gears a little bit to compliance, how does NDAA compliance or non-compliance relate to cybersecurity of physical or electronic security devices?
I'm not an NDAA expert.
I'm not an expert, but I will use it as a tool.
Okay.
Right? Because we use Hikvision as an example, which I think is something this audience will appreciate. As far as being called one of the banned companies, it was a great tool for us to go out and say, look, this is not good. Like, these cameras shouldn't be here, nor should anybody else that's on this list should not be in our infrastructure, right? And so that's something that on the commercial side that I've used with my peers is like, the government is not doing this because they just hate Hikvision, right? There's a reason why they're saying that these companies should not be used, from a national security perspective. And it's not just, security of a government facility. It's some of the folks that I work with, they're the CIOs for like Salesforce Tower in San Francisco, or, like these marquee buildings in many of our largest cities, that, if that goes offline or if something happens to it, it could be a huge, huge problem for them and their company. And so, I think from that standpoint, like, compliance really isn't the issue for us. It's another tool, and it's not really like a piece of intelligence, but it kind of is, right? For somebody who's not in this world, it's a data point that helps guide how we make our investment decisions for the capabilities that we're bringing into our infrastructure.
Okay. So I know we talked a little bit about zero trust, and I think just from the conversations I've had in the past, it seems like everybody may have their own implementation of it or their own requirements of it. But when it comes down to zero trust, and what should manufacturers be getting ready for as far as being able to deploy their devices into these applications?
So, zero trust is all a buzz. It's in every organization, at least in the .gov and DoD organizations that we support. And as I'm looking to industry, there's probably three main pillars within zero trust that are most applicable. We've been talking about the devices. Every single one of them is going to have to uniquely authenticate. So you got to have unique IDs on those, and somehow your network scanners are going to be able to grab that and be able to pair that against the authentication list to say, yep, that's good. The other area, which is interesting in zero trust, is the network layer, which is all data has to be encrypted. And so being compatible with the encryption mechanism to send your signal, to send your data through encrypted channels, I think is going to be something else that's going to be interesting. I think those are the primary two. There's probably a third one that I'm not thinking about. It's the workload pillar, which is all about considering, you have to consider that everything's connected to the internet. Even if it's not, you have to be able to thoroughly test and proactively try to pen test your devices on a regular basis to validate that the protections are in place and to understand where your exploits are. So I think those are the three that I would consider with zero trust, is being able to uniquely identify each device, authenticate, the network traffic needs to be encrypted, and then the workload management and always testing your devices to see where where your weaknesses are.
Yeah, I think from an end user customer perspective, looking at the vendors that we worked with, like we cracked this nut with a particular vendor, right? And have been working with them for a few years now as far as getting certificates on controllers. Mm-hmm. They've built a controller that can do containerized security on it. Mm-hmm. I mean, these are devices that were never intended to do this stuff, but it's starting to come to market. But I can completely appreciate for all the vendors in the room that nobody's asking for this stuff, right? And so that's the hardest part, is that there's this disconnect from this sort of CIO, CISO world of, hey, we should be doing these things, down to the folks that are buying this equipment, that have been buying it from you for years, and you as the integrator or the vendor may say, oh yeah, we know what COPT wants, right? So we continue to buy the same stuff that we want. And so, it's been a big challenge to find a vendor who is interested in heading down that path, to develop the capabilities to put to market, because the market is generally not asking for them. I mean, I think that one of the key things about zero trust, right, it's a strategy, it's not a set of controls. Mm-hmm. And that's another very difficult thing, because it's not like a standard that you can say, well, I got to meet these 150 controls. In fact, we were on a call yesterday with some state CIOs for something else I'm doing with Cami, and the zero trust came up, and the question was, hey, are you guys doing this in accordance with a NIST standard? Well, there is no NIST standard, right? And so, in the context of it being a strategy, that's where I think in this IT/OT discussion, the cybersecurity folks can really help sit down at the table and say, okay, it's these types of capabilities and the blocking and tackling we've been doing for a long time. They're all components that already exist today. It's how do we sort of check these boxes with respect to a zero trust architecture and look at those capabilities and how they're going to continue to evolve in the future. From a cybersecurity point of view, I've had this discussion, looking at privacy in these devices, right? We don't have a privacy officer, but in many ways, like privacy and cybersecurity and zero trust, like all these things, we've been doing a lot of the building blocks for a long time, but it's really going to take somebody to kind of piece them together. You're not looking at sort of a complete reinvestment of the architecture. It's, again, what do you have? Like what stuff do you already have on the shelf that can help you meet this strategy? I know in the work we do with the DoD, like in creating the DoD risk management framework package, and what we're doing there is a section in there for facility control systems and what we're doing, what's our zero trust strategy. So we've already had to kind of start to put that down on paper for all of our control systems, but we already have a lot of stuff that can meet a ton of those requirements. And so it's really just sort of understanding what that strategy is and thinking through, okay, what are my gaps, right? And then what can I be asking these, who are my vendors are to help me fill those gaps? Because that's what is going to help, I think, shift the market to bring those capabilities to us.
Yeah, just to go back and forth with you a little, absolutely, zero trust is a new way of saying defense in depth, right? For 20 years, it was defense in depth. We need to have defense in depth. So zero trust is that next iteration, next gen defense in depth, so to speak. But there are specific controls that we have to consider when applying zero trust. So it is absolutely an idea that trusts no one, trusts no device. But there also are, and I think there will be a set of controls like your 853 that will be specifically aligned. And I bet you can do that overlay today. Yeah,
I've seen some of that, right?
Yeah.
There's been some vendors that have come out and said, okay, here's how we meet different pieces and parts of the
but it's no one vendor is going to come out and have it is a integration of a lot of different capabilities down to data categorization. You hear about Zscaler or Lumio or all of these other, they are doing nothing with your data, and data is one of the main pillars in zero trust. And I think the data thing is going to be the long pole in the tent of, because I don't know if anybody's doing that outside of the IC, is doing good data categorization. But so, I'd focus more on the device pillars, the network pillars. And
the device doesn't need to do everything,
no.
Right? I mean, we've had this conversation with some of our vendors too, is like, just tell me what you think it does in this context.
Yes.
Right? Help educate me on what it is, what you're building and what problem you're trying to solve. And then I'll fit it into the bigger picture.
So kind of just going to keep going off of this a little bit. In you guys' experience, how close are we to the point of endpoint devices needing to only do token-based or certificate-based authentication and being done with password-based authentication? Is that 5 years down the road? Is it closer? Because I feel like that's part of that discussion. And that zero trust implementation is I mean, traditionally it's always been password based, but we're getting to that point.
OMB memorandum 2209 that came out in January of 22, it said all agencies must remove complex passwords from their systems and move to anti-phishing MFA. What do they call it? Phishing.
FIDO keys.
Yeah. So, and they said you have to have anti-phishing capable MFA in place by January of 2023. It's an OMB memorandum. So I don't know about you, but I didn't see anybody scurrying away from their passwords at the time. Now, granted, I do see a lot more MFA in place, and so I think that's where it needs to get to. But and of course, passwords are exploitable, and anti-phishing MFA is where we need to go. So
I think again on the on the corporate side, like I can't get a cyber insurance policy if I'm not doing MFA anymore, right? I can't, like from a board perspective, they can't defer that risk through an insurance policy. There's a set of things that they really care about, and that's one of them. So you have to be able to demonstrate that as an example. I think when I'm looking at OT systems, we're there. We are going to be deploying it here this year, if not early next year, as part of a BACnet secure implementation. The devices will have certificates on them. They will authenticate back to a centralized environment. They will have an encrypted tunnel all the way through the system, and there's going to be other capabilities on the controller to monitor any process changes, any and all communications on and off, any changes to firmware, all those sorts of things that sort of come with that device, so the device's ability to authenticate. Because once you've done that, you've sort of opened up a whole set of new opportunities to be able to do things. From a user perspective, I think a lot of it's there. Like you can use FIDO keys, you can do things. They're just not handy. Like it's not, people have been trained to put in username and password for a long, long time. MFA has been the first big step in that direction in the last, let's just say decade. But I think from the perspective of like trying to get my CEO to use a key to plug into his computer, like we give him a laptop, he doesn't take it anywhere. Like he's still using mounds and mounds of paper to do what he needs to do. And so that's still going to take some time, from a people perspective.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's table stakes. You've got to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So looking to our next session as a bit of a primer, from your perspective, how important is the role of AI when we're talking about hardening security?
Oh, goodness. I'll go back to the data. Cybersecurity, physical security, well, particularly in cybersecurity, it is a data war. And until we are able to pull in all of that data and make sense, and there's so much of it, so you can't do it through manual ways anymore. And so, we're heavily investing in machine learning to do like those aggregations we were talking about, the correlation between, your asset context, your asset attributes, what vulnerabilities are on there, what is MITRE saying are your TTPs, what's happening out there, so that you can surgically pinpoint where is your biggest exploit, or where's your biggest vulnerability or highest risk vulnerability, so that you could go and tackle that. And I also envision, through machine learning at least, creating system signatures based on the behaviors and attributes of that device, the types of technology that it is, the software that it has, the versioning. And so if you create signatures on each of your system boundaries, then you can determine, when it connects based on how it's behaving, what it's communicating with, who's communicating with it, in order to figure out what it is. Because another part of cybersecurity is understanding what that device is, who owns it, who's responsible for the security of it. So when you have 100,000 endpoints on your environment, understanding who owns it is a big deal, so you know who's responsible for securing it. And that's a big problem. They're still not able to do that, and they're trying to do it based on static IP addresses and all of that. But if we were able to, through data, machine learning, and is to create signatures for systems, for users, for everybody, so that we can quickly detect anomalous variances from those behaviors. It is key. We have to get there. Otherwise, we're just going to continue to lose against the bad actors. And so today we are investing in machine learning with respect to identifying vulnerabilities. The next step is to create signatures for systems and how they behave, different attributes about those systems, so that we can create those profiles and determine, what should be happening and what should not be happening, and then quickly respond to when we see stuff that's going awry.
Yeah, I think I'll put my CISO hat on for a minute. Folks like to ask the cybersecurity leaders kind of what keeps you up at night. This is the one thing that keeps me up at night. My rationale there is that it's going to get harder and harder to defend. It's already hard to defend, right? But from the standpoint of, one of the fun things I get to do in this job is, meet people, and we're a relatively small, mid-sized organization, which allows us to be agile, right? And we can try different things and, make investments in different places. And ran across an individual who and I'm really excited to see the next presentation, right? For a number of reasons, but I think that, ran against an individual who was taking an AI model and was using it in some airborne military platforms, but it has an OT background and felt that, hey, look, this is just all data, right? Maybe I can take this model and we can look for anomalies coming across in point data coming off OT systems. What he had done for fun one night was hopped on the dark web. The large language models that exist, ChatGPTs and so on today are sort of hamstrung by their owners, right? You can't type in and say, create me a piece of malware that does X, Y, and Z. But the example that he used to me was he hopped on a dark web one night and ran a scan, looked for some vulnerable critical infrastructure in a overseas country, went to one of the large language models that is untethered in that world, asked it to write a piece of malware to target the specific things that he had just found, was ready to execute within 15 minutes, right? With a good exploit against those targets, those critical infrastructure targets. Now, obviously, he didn't push the button, or at least he told me he didn't push the button. But that idea of anybody can go in, ask it to create something based on what they see or what they're looking to exploit, that sort of bot-on-bot world that we kind of already live in, but is going to get exponentially more complicated, kind of like all the technology in the room and technology around us, that understanding and having good AI-related defenses was something we started working on, right? And looking at how can we take the data that's coming off our systems and help to build a good model from the perspective of what's known good, and then have it identify anomalies and changes as they were already, this group is already doing for some very, very critical systems. And so I think it's going to take more investment and more thought around that, as far as how can we use these models to help us be better defenders, because the attacker's already doing it. I mean, we're seeing that from a phishing perspective. The phishing stuff is getting much, much better because somebody can just go type, have ChatGPT or somebody create them something that looks more real and it has better English in it. But from a network on network perspective, that's really what concerns me. Because it can do things much faster. It's going to be adaptable in ways that humans can't do in real time. That is really going to force the issue from a critical infrastructure perspective and how we defend.
So if we're not doing the same thing in our defense, then we're
right. Yeah, I mean, having AI-driven defensive capabilities, I think is going to be very, very important, and we're seeing that, right? So like even NSA through the Cybersecurity Collaboration Center, that's sort of for the DIB and so on, just recently announced AI Center of Excellence that they're bringing online. Everybody's trying to solve this problem in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting in where we're going to be in 5-10 years and what we're going to have to be ready for. At this time, I'd like to open it up. If anyone from the audience has a question, there's microphones there too if you want to use that. If not, not a problem.
Hi, good morning. So the main question that I had was about the new NIST standards and how your panel views that the new NIST SP 800-82 Rev 3 will likely be major factors to consider when considering the risks to operating technologies from a cybersecurity perspective. A lot of critical infrastructure across the United States, as you know, is very OT dependent.
Yeah, so I'll start, right? So like for us, we have a series of buildings, like I said, that we lease to the government. It's driven by intelligence community policy that references 882 in that. And so it's, right now it references Rev 2. I'm sure we'll get a modification that references Rev 3. But yeah, I mean, the fact that they're adapting that standard to be more relevant than it was when it was written previously, focused really heavily on control systems. And I kind of look at critical infrastructure sort of in two ways, right? And I think they're going to do a better job with the new revision that's come out and balancing this. 62443 as a standard has the same challenge in that it's sort of very heavy on the generation side of OT, right? Power generation, hydroelectric, oil and gas generation, right? And we were talking a lot about life safety and the CIA sort of being reversed. It's all about availability. I wouldn't even put confidentiality necessarily there. Whereas on the demand side of critical infrastructure, the side that I live on, we have sort of a very different view of what those requirements mean and the ones that we're going to pick, right? We do have life safety concerns, but they're not in the same vein as a pipeline system, for example. And so I think we have an opportunity there where we're going to be able to tailor that far more appropriately than we probably have in the past.
A couple of questions. First, where does a commercial company start with this? Meaning, Tasha, you are part of an organization, I think, that puts people together, right? And I'd like to have you explain that a little bit. And from Marcy, from your perspective, you said a lot of things that make a lot of sense to a person that has to kind of sort out all these different sides of this, right? From a vendor's perspective and a end user perspective, and making pieces and parts come together. But how do we get your view or your opinion in a way that we can get it in front of customers and make them open their minds up a little bit to really kind of understand? I think, Ken, you said the same thing. We really got to, what applies to what? So can you guys maybe talk a little bit to those two things?
Sure. I'll start a little bit about, talking about the Cybersecurity Association. I think that we strive to be the exact definition of bringing everybody to the table in a way to have conversations exactly like we're having here today. I think I heard a couple of things that Marcy and Ken said throughout, and it's really listening to how other people outside of your realm, outside of your silo, your silos of excellence is a term I heard recently that I really enjoyed, how those folks are understanding and talking about their issues and voicing what's really important to them. And I think, it doesn't happen as quickly sometimes as we would like, especially, when we have sales quotas and other deadlines, other external factors. But I think having forums like this, opening up conversation and just understanding in places like that. And the other thing that we've had to come to terms with is that not everybody is going to want to have these conversations right now, but once they see that these things are happening and that really they're going to be left behind if they don't, don't worry about the detractors. Really focus on those people who are committed to pushing things forward and coming together in forums like this.
And the second part of your question is what strategies do you have to talk to your clients about moving ahead with some of these controls within OT products? Did I get that right?
Yes, how to differentiate what applies and what doesn't apply based on the system or the actual device.
Yeah, goodness gracious. It's getting somebody that's willing to listen. And isn't that funny? You get assigned somebody that you're working with and you're trying to implement it with an environment and you're trying to be compliant, but at the same time, just secure. And if the other person at the other side of the table just has a checklist in front of them that says, well, it says here, you got to do these things. I don't want to hear anything outside of that. Then you need to maybe get somebody else on the other side of the table, honestly. Because sometimes we hit walls, and sometimes it's a matter of escalating. All right, this is an interesting perspective. Let's bring some more people into this conversation. Let's get a different perspective. I'm sure we're going to get there. And so it's sort of gaming who you're working with. But it's if you really feel like they're starting with no and they're not getting past the brick wall, you're not hearing them because you know what, they've got 10 other clients behind you or systems behind you that they are working deadlines against. You need to escalate, and I recommend escalating. Don't just shut down viable, needed capabilities because your cybersecurity practitioner says, I have a checklist here and it doesn't work, you can't do this. Really drive conversation and understand why are you implementing this control? You were saying that earlier. Let's get to the why, let's get to the who, let's get them in the room. It's hard. And, we support system owners as well. So we're ISSMs, ISSOs for system owners, for OT, supporting the Pentagon. And we're battling this on a daily basis. Somebody on the other side of the table has their ATO, dangling their ATO in front of you and said, you can't do this until you patch that system. And it's like, wait a minute, there's no active exploits against this today. If I patch it, it's going to break it. And there's no exploits. Let's make a risk-based decision about this. And so even if you have to sort of work it all the way up to your AO, then you do that. Because truly your cyber operators, the compliance people should be looking at this as a mission enablement and not as some sort of checklist thing that we're walking through, because that's silly.
Yeah, and I would give you sort of another scenario, right, where we have, I've really gotten to know some of our reps, for better or for worse, because, we recently had a meeting with our OT team, and we had heard through the representatives or through some marketing materials we got, we're a heavy Tritium Niagara user as far as our platform that integrates all of our stuff together. In that platform, there's a security dashboard, right? Well, we never turned it on. Well, and the OT team guys, right, we love them to death, but they're like, well, you've told us you have this VPN thing, so we didn't think we had to do any of that. Well, guys, don't you think we might be interested? Right? So I think as an integrator or as a vendor, if you have something to sell and that message is not getting through, like there's other people in the company that are probably going to be interested in it. Even though you may be used to dealing with this one segment or party or group of people within that organization. Because, what I've stressed to some of these folks has been, you have capability, particularly on the security side, we need it. I don't care what that team says, we need it. Right? Let me know what it is. Like, let's have a conversation about it. We may not buy it, I don't know. But it's sort of like reach outside the comfort zone of dealing with the people you've always dealt with and say, look, we're selling this thing. We think it's really, really important that you know that it exists. Can we talk to somebody else in the company, maybe your CIO or CISO or whoever? Because guaranteed they probably have no idea that it's an option. And I've got money to pay for things, right? And they're afraid of blowing their budget. We'll give them the money that they need to bring the right capabilities in as part of these projects too, because there's other ways to recover that they just that's not their job. They don't they're not responsible for that. They're told they have $50,000 or $100,000 to do a job. They're gonna do it and cut things out. Whereas if we made some better decisions or more informed decisions, I shouldn't say better, but more informed decisions earlier on. There are literally check boxes in some of these systems that we would have turned on that would have greatly improved our security posture, but they didn't know what it did, didn't want to know, didn't care, for better or for worse, right?
Didn't understand.
You didn't understand, and that's probably the biggest issue.
One last question, and I'll stop. Everything you said kind of answered a lot of questions that I wanted to ask, but I really appreciate everybody's input. Like Marcy said, I think we could all sit here if you had the patience and the mind power not to get overwhelmed to talk about this for days. But thank you very much, and I really appreciate it.
I'll echo Steve. Thank you guys very much for taking your time out of your busy schedules to come down here and have this conversation with us. Thank you.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Bosch, invented for life.